ideas in this book, Thomas. I want to jump into some of these, all right? You look specifically at the summer of 2020, but this book takes us back a little bit about the promise of Barack Obama and talks about this promise of post-racialism and how the failures, I believe you say, the failures to take action in that or to find this moment of post-racialism, you could draw a direct line from that to this era of Trump and MAGA. Explain that for me a little bit.
Yeah, I think we had a moment in the beginning of this century when the country seemed to come, not everyone in the country, but a plurality of people in the country, maybe even a slim majority of people in the country, really wanted to put the past oppressions and biases behind us and create this multi-ethnic society that Barack Obama's figure kind of gave us a hint of what could be. You know, and so there was this moment of goodwill, and even there were polls in Gallup that a majority of McCain voters even thought that this was an inspiring moment, even in loss, and that...
Fake news. I don't believe that for a second. There was a moment where people on the other side were like, this is still inspiring.
It's hard to believe.
I don't remember that.
It was a different country. It might have been a temporary moment, but there was a moment when people seemed to want to transcend the kind of conflicts that we had been plagued by in the previous century. And Barack Obama's figure was a special charismatic kind of idea of a post-racial future embodied in the president. And I think that we had a chance, but it didn't last so long.
Yeah, so what?
It didn't last so long.
Well, you mentioned in here that this sort of clicked with you. You're a teacher as well, with the disconnect you had with your students. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm about 20 years older than the undergrads that I teach. And they can't remember the Obama era. This idea that there was a moment where we would become, now it seems naive to say post-racial.
And post-racial is such a loaded term now. It almost feels antiquated.
It feels antiquated, and people don't really take you seriously if you say you believe in post-racialism, but there was a moment when that seemed to point to something that we could become, that seemed to be a kind of, it was downstream of Martin Luther King's idea of the mountaintop, you know, and that we would meet each other and judge each other by the contents of our character. It seemed, when it was earnestly embraced, like a vision of America that we were moving towards, the arc of history bent towards justice, you know, and that was a moment that I don't believe that, you know, the Gen Z students and soon to be the Gen Alpha students that I teach, like, have direct contact with, and so it seems like abstract history to them, and when I try to kind of evoke that in the classroom, that sense of optimism that we had, that hope and change, when Barack Obama said, you know, we're not red states, we're not blue states, we're the United States of America, there was a moment where I truly believed in that, because I came up when that kind of defined the political possibilities of my generation, and I noticed this absence with the young kids, with the young adults that I teach undergrad now, and I find that to be kind of a real tragedy of the political culture that we've inherited since that crucial turning point when we reached this fork in the road where we could have gone to this nicer, more perfected union.
How could we have done that? Because I mean, this book is critical of the left and the way in which they handled that movement, right? Like, how do you see? What are the criticisms you see in the way that the left and Obama handled that movement, and where was the actual space for a post-racial America?
That's a very good question. I think that there was a space where, and you might call this also, you know, I think there's a lot of room to push back and critique this, but I think there was
give me a shot.
So there was a moment where I think a lot of very well-intentioned white people, let's call them, you know, white liberals.
Sure, okay. I'm tracking, yes.
Where a lot of them probably felt like we've done it. You know, we've really done it. We've decided to put a race behind us, an identity behind us, right? And so we've elected somebody who is embodying that new America that we're moving towards. And there was a chance to really be post-racial. But I think there were several missteps, and I can understand how they happened, and I think it's a tragedy how they happened. But one of the real inflection points that I tried to get into in the book is when Barack Obama said, you know, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon Martin. And at the time that it happened, I didn't really appreciate that that was a rhetorical misstep. I think that, I really understand what he was trying to say. But I can also see now in retrospect how we had elected Barack Obama and we had believed that we were moving past race. And we had believed that we were moving past these divisions. It's appalling that a boy is stalked and killed because that's an appalling thing to do, full stop. And I think that, when he injected the kind of identity angle into it, people said, we haven't actually become post-race at all. In fact, this is a kind of identity angle, and I feel excluded from this. I try to, think of the example of, think of Laken Riley, who was this young woman in Georgia who was murdered by an undocumented immigrant. Imagine if Donald Trump said, if I had a daughter, she'd look like Laken Riley. That could actually really be explosively divisive. Not to say that he's not explosively divisive every day.
Don't you think?
But think about what that would inject into the conversation about it. Almost a kind of white nationalism.
You think that's what it would begin? Well, I mean, I think that's a curious point there, right? But Laken Riley is somebody who has, from my perspective, been weaponized by the right.
Absolutely.
As a victim that the left doesn't see. And I remember that moment with Barack Obama and Trayvon Martin. And from my perspective, it felt like a very powerful moment when Barack Obama saw himself and his family in this victim here. My memory of it was less that he brought race to that situation. I feel like he had an entire media ecosystem on the right that was making Barack Obama the black president.
Absolutely.
That was consistently projecting this and race baiting and fear mongering. And so in some ways it felt like that moment was like a necessary moment of inclusion. That identity, he didn't bring up identity. Identity was somewhat thrust on him as a weapon.
Well, it shows how little leeway he had and how there was no room for any mishap. And that's what I think is the tragedy of his presidency, actually. It was always too much for one person, even as magnificent and excellent, and I think as elegant a person as he was. It was too much for one person to ever be able to handle, because the moment anybody could kind of put a misstep on you, then it was much more extreme and much more significant than it would have been for another president.
But you still see there was a moment of hope in that.
I really do. And
so do you see that does that give you ultimate hope that there's space there, or does it ultimately depress you because that was a missed opportunity?
Both. I think I have to call myself a optimist. But both. You can't just be one or the other. And I think that the vision of America that I was exposed to, I can never forget. And so I have to be an optimist as long as I know that moment existed and I lived it. The night he won in 2008 in November, I was in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, walking through the streets. I've never seen, such civic pride. And the thing I felt in the streets that day is the country that I believe we will one day have back. I think it's really under siege. I think it's the most dangerous moment I've ever lived through now. But having glimpsed that, I don't believe the future belongs to Donald Trump and the movement he's trying to bring in. I really can't accept that.
I think it's the major part, the big chunk of this book looks really at the summer of 2020. And it's fascinating to look back at something that feels in some ways like it was a month ago, in some ways it feels like 100 years ago. But you really walk through it from a critical eye towards what the progressive response to that was. And I think you're very clear about, you don't hold back on your critiques of the left, but make it clear that in order for people to find that step perhaps away from Donald Trump, you need to be pretty clear-eyed about the mistakes that you made, specifically in the summer of 2020. What do you see those major missteps as?
Well, how much time you got?
Well, I mean, you focus on, that was such a chaotic time. You're looking at COVID and you're looking at George Floyd, right? Talk to me about George Floyd and where you see the flaws of the left in the response to George Floyd.
Sure. So you have really, and thank you for bringing that up, you have a confluence of events. You have the pandemic, which makes possible a kind of reaction to this horrific videotaped execution that really looks, it's a 9-minute long slow death that's recorded. So that happens at a moment when everybody is at home, sidelined from their normal lives, with a lot of time and attention and glued to these screens that homogenize all of our shared reality. And then hanging above that, you have the specter of Donald Trump telling people to ingest bleach and to, you know, to shine light on themselves as a way of fighting an epidemic that we still don't fully understand, and it's terrorizing the body politic. So you have this kind of moment where so many missteps were made, but one of the most extreme things that I think was really done by people who would be left of center and progressive was that they squandered the kind of institutional authority that they had in our mainstream institutions. They squandered trust, so that you have epidemiologists and public health authorities saying one day that you really can't be outside because, you know, it's too dangerous to mask collectively, and people are trying to kill your grandmother if they're outside, or if they're trying to, you know, if they're.
Do you have sympathy for that? That was a fluid situation at the time.
Of course, I have sympathy for that. But what I don't have as much sympathy for is that the next day, after George Floyd dies tragically, is that then it's like racism is also an epidemic, and you actually must be outside now because we actually have to protest against this other pandemic, and the risk is now tolerable. It's either the COVID-19 doesn't discriminate based on which ideological standpoint you're at.
Yeah.
You know, so that was a major mistake by the kind of public health messaging that was picked up by other outlets on the left. Then you had the kind of reporting that I think was a massive squandering of institutional authority. I think maybe people in this audience remember a chyron that said fiery but mostly peaceful protests. I don't think that people who lived through seeing cities burn, and you know, downtown New York City, Soho, it was getting crazy in Soho sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, all of the stores were boarded up. There were police guards outside of Nike. You know, there were people were looting. To say, it's one thing to say that that's sometimes what happens.
Right.
You know, but it's another thing to say that this isn't happening. Don't believe your lying eyes. Mm-hmm. You know, it's really mostly peaceful. It's really Kenosha is not burning.
You feel that's embedded in some of the frustrations that the MAGA movement picked up.
I don't think it justifies. You know, I think you know there's ways of responding to something that's not right that goes so far beyond an appropriate response that they create a new problem that's far greater than the original offense.
But at the time, though, at the time, you do see a left who is like. You're advocating for a more rational response.
Yes.
But it felt like it was an irrational time.
Very much so.
With a person in charge who was fear-mongering, giving you false information, who was race baiting with all of the moments, with what was happening with George Floyd, and that I know that you're against elements of the identity politics and how the Democrats have clung to it, but it didn't feel like, at the time, it didn't feel like that was the choice Democrats were making. It felt like that was the reality they were embracing. And had a real earnest desire to use that moment and to use that anger to try to enact some kind of change. I know you don't think that was done correctly, but what do you do with that energy in a moment that is so irrational?
It's a very good question. I think that in retrospect, it's very easy to judge a lot of things. In the moment, you know, I think that emotion and a sense of solidarity can be very compelling, but they can also cloud judgment. You know, I think that there's something ludicrous when you look back at Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer kneeling in kente cloth.
Yeah, it's
a weird look.
It's a weird look. It's not a good look. It didn't fit correctly either as well. I mean, they didn't do very well.
It's a weird look, but you can understand this kind of, we all feel this impulse to empathize with the victim. But what I'm trying to get at in this book is like, the America that I want to achieve is like, what was George Floyd's primary identity? Certainly he was black, but his black experience is not the universal black experience. First and foremost, his identity was that this was a poor man. This was a man out of work. This was a man who was broken by police and was able to be violated in the way he was because he had no socioeconomic protection. And I think that, like, to talk about it only as a matter of identity actually limits our ability to engage non-black people in the struggle, which is that no American should be okay with law enforcement being able to break somebody, especially a poor person without any resources, the way that they broke George Floyd, whatever color you are.
Do you see a space? Is there a space in the middle? Is there a space between no identity politics and identity politics that someone is walking right now, or you see as a potential lane for somebody to walk?
I think so. I think the way you and I are talking, I'm cognizant of the fact that you seem to be descended from Europeans, though I would never assume.
That is the kindest way to address my race. Cognizant of the fact that you're a pasty mother.
But what I would like it to tell me as little about you as possible. I would like that to be as I would like to not make assumptions based on that, on those superficial identity markers that I see. I want to understand you as an individual. I want to understand where you come from. I want to understand what experiences you've had in America, and not just assume things based on the texture of your hair, the color of your eyes, and your epidermis. And that's really what
It's curious. I will say, like, there's a lot in this book. I found this book really challenging and fascinating. I very much enjoyed it. And something you talk about, you spend a lot of your time in France, is the ways in which a place like, how the French see identity compared to how Americans see identity. And like, what are some of the takeaways you have of looking at what American identity politics is from the point of view of somebody who's spent so much time in a place like France?
Yeah, I wrote an article in The Atlantic a few years ago about the kind of ideal society would be some place in between France and America. You know, France has this commitment to universalism and what they call laïcité, and this idea that there's just the French citizen, and you leave your everything for the Jew privately, but nothing for the Jew collectively as a group. That's how it, kind of originated, and then now with Islam and Muslims, this kind of idea that you leave that ethnic or religious identity in your home. Outside, everybody's a French citizen. This has a lot of strengths to it. They don't actually, they've struck the word race from all. The government doesn't recognize racial difference, but that's actually kind of like where you would say, if you had to say, like, what's the ideal society you would like to get to? You would say, in theory, I would like to get to that society. But in practice, you actually don't know how many French citizens of Arab descent are in jail and how the criminal justice system operates.
Yeah, so by doing that, you don't have any awareness of what the patterns are with
exactly. So you have some real drawbacks to that. But you would have to say that I would like to get there, as opposed to a kind of society where we permanently kind of fetishize our differences and think that, like, here I am, a descendant of slaves, here you are, a descendant of slave masters.
I like the earlier descriptor you used.
And that we can never kind of understand each other, and that there's an epistemological divide between us. You would have to say that you would want to get to the society of the universal citizen. But in practice, there are some real stumbling blocks, and sometimes the kind of American way of speaking has a place. So I think what you're talking about is a kind of nuanced approach that recognizes and respects identity differences, but doesn't make that the whole game, and doesn't ever allow that to occlude the ability of the individual to what about the minority within the minority? I think sometimes when we talk about differences of identity, we forget that there are Muslims who disagree about what the proper direction of Islam is. There are blacks who have very powerful critiques of affirmative action and reparations. There are Jews who see the war in Gaza completely differently. So there is no Jewish point of view. There is no woman's point of view. There are just people who come from these backgrounds and have lots of competing viewpoints. From 2020, the example that I really take about this is that for a moment there was so much understandable empathy about policing that people said, this is terrible. Like, black people are being killed in the streets by police. We have to do something about it. Okay, let's defund, or even in some cases abolish the police, because that would be what's in black people's favor. And then suddenly, the homicides go up. You really have serious consequences in Minneapolis and other places that experimented with this stuff, and you have this inconvenient result that a lot of black people are screaming and saying, bring the police back. I'm the one getting shot here. My daughter is getting shot here. There is no black point of view that agrees on that. So you actually have to listen to differing viewpoints. People don't have a monolithic kind of identity. And so I think that is what is the risk in a kind of American identity-forward, multi-ethnic society where you stay in your corner, I stay in my corner, when I'm speaking, you listen to me because I have some epistemological advantage over you that's based on ancestry and can't be bridged. So I think the ideal society has a softer approach than the French, who can be too tough with their universalism, but never kind of skews too far into fetishizing the difference the way that we do now.
Well, it's truly a fascinating read, and I appreciate most of this conversation. The slave owner thing, maybe not as much, but a great chat. Thomas, thank you
so much.
Thank you. Summer of Our Discontent is out August 5th and available to pre-order. Thomas Chatterton Williams.